Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon to our friends on the West Coast. I am Todd Obert of Productive Corporation. Joined alongside me up in Toronto is Mark Sangster, author and cybersecurity expert at Adlumin. Does a lot of product strategy for them as well. And he's going to talk to us today about the anatomy of a cyber attack. As you know, if you've been to our events, how we do it, we meet productive in 1 minute, then we get right into it. Probably one of the best things that will happen is to get me off the microphone. We're going to turn it over to Mark. He's going to talk about the current threat landscape. He's going to talk about, what steps to look at when you're under attack, how to communicate the threat and the attack with top execs or impending attacks to make sure they really understand the order of magnitude of what's happening. And he'll also kind of talk about how you guys in IT might view the threats differently than other people in the organization and why that is and how to kind of navigate that. So buckle up, get ready for an awesome presentation. But first, who is Productive Corp? Well, I'm very glad, even though you're muted, that you asked that. Productive Corporation helps improve the security posture of mid-sized companies. That's what we do. That's what we've been doing for over 20 years. We also offer specialized expertise to help understand your overall security needs, like a NIST assessment, for example. We can take you right through. I think you can do that off the homepage. We also implement, test, and optimize the products that we sell. We do security assessments. We do AD security services. We can help config that firewall or UTM. In addition, we produce a lot of third-party content, educational content for our customers, much like the webinar you're on today. You can view all of this on productivecorp.com/solving security. Bottom line is, we have a lot of resources, whether it's assessment, implementation, licensing, or security services. We're here to help you. If you need something, help at productivecorp.com. It goes to everybody. We get on it. Doesn't really matter what it is. We want to help you out. So that's what we do. All right. As I said at the top of the broadcast, very excited to have Mark Sangster here today. And really interested to hear what he has to say. He's with Adlumin. As you know, Adlumin's really a leader in the, well, I'm going to call it, a lot of people have different acronyms, MDR, MTR. I'd say these guys are a leader in the MDR space, have really a lot of cool technology. Probably not going to dig into that a ton. If you want, we can do that later or set you up with somebody on the team to talk more about that. But Mark has a pretty cool talk, and really looking forward to hear what he has to say. So let's give a warm virtual round of applause for Mark Sangster. Mark?
Hey, thanks so much, Todd. I'm just going to share my window here, my screen. Give me 1 second. And there we go. So everybody can see that by the looks of it?
Looking awesome.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So today I'm going to start by telling you a story that has nothing to do with cybersecurity. And then I'm going to bring it back to cybersecurity because it has everything to do with accountability and liability, frankly, right? And that's honestly what cybersecurity is. Cybersecurity is not an IT problem to solve. Rather, it is a business risk to manage. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to bring us back to cybersecurity. I'm going to talk about some of the things that we see today. And then, what do you do about it? How do you communicate that to your base? So the first thing I'm going to do is, and you'll see this in almost all of my talks, I use movie quotes or some kind of literature or something, and literary references, I should say. And so today I'm going to start with this one. Only after disaster can we be resurrected. And of course, that's from the fictitious character Tyler Durden from Fight Club, which is disturbingly over 20 years old now. But while he's fictitious, the sentiment is accurate and real. And there's lots of different ways we describe this, right? Churchill said something about like never let a crisis go to waste, and there's plenty more that kind of give us the sentiment that we learn more from our mistakes than we do from our successes. And I think that's true, right? When we're successful, we kind of go, hey, that was a great job, and we move on. And we don't really do the critical thinking around what made it successful, how much was luck, how much was good decision-making, informed decision-making, and so on. And that's really what business decisions in cybersecurity have to be. I get asked all the time about this. You know, are you going to help us? Are you going to tell us when to call an insurer? Are you going to do this and that? And it's like, I'm not. What I am going to do is I'm going to teach you, give you the skills so that you know what questions to ask, the types of answers you're looking for, and depending on that informed information, making that informed decision so that you are mitigating the risk and you're reducing whatever the potential negative impact would be. All right, so let's get on with this, and I'll tell you this. I'll start with the story I promised you, and this one is from Citicorp Tower, which back in the late 1970s was being built in New York City, and most of us recognize this structure. It's fairly iconic with its kind of triangular pyramid type of roof. And interestingly, though, the tower actually not only is the sort of the crown of the tower interesting, but it's actually it does happen. This wasn't like a, a sort of a strongman example of somebody saying, well, if we get to 300-mile-an-hour winds, some mega tornado was to hit New York City, it would fall over. Well, sure, I'm sure a lot of buildings would. This was within the realm of possible and strongly probable, frankly. So it turns out, again, a much longer story, but after agonizing over what to do about this, the architect and the construction engineer, they went to the board of Citicorp. They told them what was going on. They actually made claims against their own personal liability insurance in the amount of $2 million. They threw their money in the pot. The bank agreed we needed to do something. Now, 1977 back in those days is not 2023 with social media and instant access to to data and information and so on. So the city was able to hide this fact, and secretly at night, workers went in and reinforced the skyscraper's internal structure over about a 3-month period. And what makes the story even more exciting is that, of course, that summer there happened to be a hurricane rolling and building across the Atlantic that was heading for New York City. Now, it turned out that one, they were able to reinforce the structure in time, and two, the tornado actually turned back out to sea. So it gave a glancing blow to the city, and it never really hit it directly the way that Hurricane Sandy in 2012 did. Now, like I said, this wasn't 2023. This is, 50 years ago almost. So it remained a secret, and it wasn't actually until a journalist discovered it nearly 20 years later and wrote a story about it, an expose in New Yorker magazine. And, by then the city didn't care. And so all of this stuff came out. And when you look at it, I put the issues they had into 3 big buckets, right? The first was accountability. The building codes of the day didn't actually match what this new technology was doing, right? That should sound familiar to you in cybersecurity and in IT. Yes, there were public safety issues like secretly doing this at night and not informing people and all that kind of stuff, which of course we'd all lose our minds at today and couldn't happen. There was also the ethical issues of the professional and financial ruin, both to the architect and to the structural engineering, the engineer and the company and so on. And this story, because of what they did, the fact that they stepped up, has become an ethics case that is used in most licensed practices. So things like architecture, engineering, etc., but also in the legal space and other professional schools to say, this is what you're supposed to do. When this happens, yes, it sucks. Maybe you made a mistake. Maybe there's a bunch of contributing factors that have led to an unfortunate circumstance. But at the end of the day, you got to step up, right? And we often don't see that in cybersecurity at the executive level, and I'll talk about that. The real dilemma came from the supply chain. There were construction deviations which met the code but didn't actually meet what the structural engineer and the architect were trying to do. So they bolted these sections of metal framing together. They needed to be welded because bolts aren't as strong as welds, because when the building moves back and forth and so on, there's a lot of friction, there's a lot of force that's applied to the bolts, and they can shear off and break. And there was the exposures of the technology of the building, right? It was this interesting cantilevered structure, and it lacked the standard sort of structural safety that most buildings have. Like if, the analogy I use here is think about a four-legged chair and your kid's leaning back and sticking their feet on the dining room table, right? If you've got four legs, it's hard to topple that chair. But if you move those legs to the middle of the sides of the seat of the chair, it would be super easy on an angle, on a 45-degree angle, to kind of push that chair over because there's zero support. And in fact, there's almost like this levered piece that, it can easily just flip on the two legs in the center of the sides. And that's exactly why this building needed new types of building codes for this type of technology. And since then, there's been lots of cantilevered types of things like bridges and so on. And now, everybody, not only the engineers and the architects, but the cities and the governance organizations now understand that you kind of got to up your game here. So let's talk cybersecurity. One of the biggest issues I see, I get asked this all the time. Why do all these things keep happening, right? We buy all the security tech, we have these great partners and so on, and yet this keeps happening. And I personally think it's because, and if anybody recognizes this movie, right, it's from The Usual Suspects. It's the greatest trick that the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist. And okay, that's a little bit over the top. But when you think about it, it's not, because so many companies labor under the misconception that, okay, maybe the devil they know exists, but they don't think the devil's going to come calling, right? We have nothing worth stealing. We're not in that kind of business. We're not a bank or a government agency. Breaches are the result of mistakes. That's an easy psychological thing that lets you off the hook, right? Well, I'm spending all this money on security. Those companies that got hacked, they probably didn't have anything, right? They were cheap. They didn't want to invest. Whatever it is, our people are smarter and brighter and more talented than their people were. There were no signs prior to the attack. I'm going to show you that that's 100% not true. And that's often what occurs is once something happens, I see this sort of, shaking of the hands, I guess, that says, look, on Friday, everything was great. And we came back to work on Monday and we were shut down. And, we didn't know anything was happening. And sometimes associated with this one, of course, is also the other one, which is the, we're this small company, how are we ever going to stop an attack from like a big nation state like China or, some Russian ransomware gang? And of course, the last one is the false sense of security, which is we have insurance and backups, so we're fine. So the analogy I have is cover your eyes, take your seatbelt off, disable your airbags in your car, and you just put your foot down on the gas and you drive, and you cross the interstate or through a busy part of town, and you tell me if you'd be willing to do that, because that's exactly what you're doing in the cybersecurity analogy. When you aren't, when you're assuming you have these backups and safety nets, they're going to catch you partially, but it's a lot more complicated than that, and it's going to hurt a lot. And that's because these guys are tough. And this information comes from a bunch of public sourced information and partners that we work with, but also through our own security operations. And this is the kind of things we see, right? They operate like Fortune 500 companies. I call them the Misfortune 500, in fact. They're often funded and sponsored by states, or they have alignment with them. So, Russia says, hey, you're attacking Americans. That works for us politically. So, be my guest. We're not going to interfere or arrest you. They know how to go after the supply chain and DevOps exploits. We've seen this with Microsoft and SolarWinds and Kaseya and a bunch. They're back to leveraging systemic vulnerabilities when we find them again, like Log4j, right? And they're really good at SEO manipulation and manipulating your security controls. And I'm not talking about, in some cases, it's more about duping people into doing the wrong thing, and they just don't understand what they're doing, and that's fine, right? They become an unwitting accomplice, but it's because these guys are that good. So I'll give you some quick examples. These are ones I've pulled actually from our operations, right? This is one where somebody posed as a fake student looking for a mentor in their, as they were in their graduate program. And after they had spent some time with these individuals, they then flipped them this email that said, hey, thanks so much. Would you mind, completing this survey that there's a link to so that I get my academic credit? And it turns out the survey had been stolen from a prestigious school, and it was weaponized, and that's how they got in. This is another one where criminals were using stolen legal documents, so things like court records from things like lawsuits and patent infringement suits and stuff like malpractice, things like that, right? So nothing too fancy. Changing the names to protect the innocent. They then did the research to figure out what law firms conducted this kind of business, who had been named in these suits or representing the parties in these suits. They set up fake safe rooms so that, you know, you got the information just like you would from a real law firm. Hey, you're being notified of this. This is what it looks like. Here's your login information to go to this site so that you can get, you know, the additional, all the documents and files and stuff you're going to need. So unfortunately, by then, you know, your CEO, your CFO, and likely your legal counsel have all been owned. They even go after your IT. So as people move to like cloud-based services and so on, for a while there was a major Azure issue where you could basically pop up one of these fake logins and somebody would log in, they would collect your credentials because they weren't encrypted. They then forward them on to the Azure servers at Microsoft that would authenticate you and actually log you into whatever Office service it was. So as far as you're concerned, what you expected to happen, happened, right? So you have no idea that your credentials have been skimmed along the way. And then this last one is a nasty example of where they are literally engineering you, not like looking at your LinkedIn and your Facebook, but they're doing things like Google Analytics and figuring out what executives search for and what do business leaders search for, then stealing those tools or creating fake versions of them and then posting them either on innocent websites that host them or creating, you know, similar sounding websites that have the free tool rather than the one you got to pay for, and they hope that people click on that link and download that document, and that's another way of infiltrating your environment. So that's why I say you're going to need a bigger boat, right? And this is obviously from the movie Jaws, right, where Sheriff Chief Brody saw this. And a real quick sidebar, that was not actually in the script. It turned out that that was a running joke that the cast and crew had on the production because they had this barge called the SS Junkyard. They kept getting swamped by swells out in the ocean when they were trying to film. And every time equipment fell off the barge, they kept saying, oh, you're going to need a bigger boat. And when the scene happens where Roy Scheider sees the great white shark for the first time, he's supposed to say something else. We'll never know. And he came out with this line, which of course has become famous and, you know, is entrenched in pop culture. And it's true of cybersecurity. I want you to understand this. The left-hand bar there, they build a very clever campaign. This is not your network's credit card has been rejected kind of nonsense. This is not some free travel thing. They pulled publicly available information that's already been stolen. They are putting all of that into play before they come at you. And then when they do, there's multiple stages that they move through, from the white here to the pink at the end or the magenta at the end, which is the business disruption piece, right? Whether you're shut down by ransomware, whether they breached you, whatever it might be. And understand this, because it's good news, bad news. The bad news I'll start with is that A, it's probably the insurer's incident response firm that they bring in when you make a claim that's going to find this stuff. And B, they're sophisticated. They know how to move around your environment. They're really good at using your own tools against you and so on. But the good news in this is they're in your environment for a while. They're touching lots of things. They're making noise, leaving fingerprints, creating motion, things that if you know what you're looking for, you can catch. And the executive message for this is you are capable of stopping these guys. They are highly sophisticated, but a lot of the tools and techniques they use, they might build beautiful homes, but at the end of the day, they still use hammers and screwdrivers and wrenches. You know how to deal with those. And that's the thing, is if you invest properly, you can stop these things. And that's why I say, look, if you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. And, you know, this is from the movie Dodgeball.
Oh, great.
Yeah, if anybody knows the 5Ds. Yeah,
Dodge,
go for it.
Duck, dive. No. Dive,
Close.
duck, yeah.
Dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge.
Yeah,
Great movie.
dodge, dive, dip, duck, and dodge. Yeah, nice.
Such a great movie, but it again applies in cybersecurity, because you need, the execs need to help, we need to help them collectively understand what the risks look like, what their obligations look like, and understand how they're going to manifest when they appear at your organization. And yeah, if you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. If you know what the worst looks like and you can plan for that, you know, let's hope for the best. And I will talk a little bit for a minute about what we do. And that's, you know, a lot of what we're doing and why this applies to what we're talking about here is that we were founded by two gentlemen from the NSA. And in fact, a lot of our employees are ex-military, are also ex-NSA. And one of them, and this is what I think is unique, one of them ran an attack squadron. So they were going out and attacking other nations. Yes, we do it. And then the other partner was on the defensive side. And he ran the security operations that had to stop China and Russia and North Korea and all these places. So that unique combination of one saying, well, here's how I go about attacking you, and the other one, you know, kind of learning from that, figuring out how to defend, is the DNA that we put into our products and service. So we have a platform that can detect these things, right? That spots them based on what I've talked about previously. We have a service that sits on top of it. If you don't know how to use the platform, you don't have enough resources or whatever it is, that's not in any way an insult. We all have to focus on our business, and we all have limited resources. We have signs to see those early indicators that something's going on, and then to defend. And then we also have a bunch of add-on modules that, you know, we integrate. So things like patch management and penetration testing and awareness training and so on, that we help organizations build out that risk side. We help them talk to execs, like what is it we have to convey here? What do they need to know? And here's one of the big messages, that when they buy tools, when you're an IT person and you're bringing in all these various pieces, you often get it sort of shrugged off. Well, we have firewalls and antivirus and all this stuff. I spend all this money on security. We should be safe. Well, the problem is those things do fundamental jobs. They do it well, but the attacks lurk in between all of these systems. And so we see about 40 billion events a quarter, every 90 days, of which, you know, about 100,000 are really dangerous. Let's say 10,000 of them are. And all the time when I show this to executives, they say, okay, so 10,000 is a rounding error around 40 billion. And they're right. It goes the other way. You have to scour the 40 billion to find the 10,000 that could become business disrupting. And that's the real challenge here. So when it comes to working with execs, it's more than reporting, right? Everybody should know this movie too. I hope you got your flair, right?
Yes.
It's office space, right? And so when it comes to reporting and working with executives, I put it into three broad buckets. One, you need to be able to translate the ones and zeros into dollar signs and cents and help them understand, where have they met their obligations? Are we compliant? Are we doing the things we need to do? Providing, you know, sort of the audit reports and things that they may need to pass on to their powers that be, right? So whether that's a regulator or investors or customers, whatever, whoever the stakeholder is, making sure you can show that. From your perspective, being able to demonstrate the value, right? So what security activities do we have going today? Can we show them that what we are doing is effective, that we are protected, and that they've spent and invested the money and the resources the right way about doing this? And have we aligned them to their goals? And that's a lot of what I do, is, you know, risk registries and figuring out, how do you do that? And how do you know what's important and where you focus? Because at the end of the day, you can't protect everything, right? You got to figure out what your vault is with your money and, you know, precious objects. And that's what you really got, you know, that's where you want to put your emphasis and your protection. And then of course is the compliance part, right? And I don't want to say that's a checking the box, because I fundamentally believe that security actually can get you a long way to compliance. They're not the same thing. They do have a lot of overlap, and a lot of the work that you need to do to remain compliant, to demonstrate compliance, comes out in that, right? So we've already done a lot of that. So how can you help? So when it comes down to it, there's 5 basic things that we need to do collectively with our execs to help them understand the risk. The first one is awareness. Do we understand the impact of cyber risks and the trends that we're seeing, right? Do we understand what the business impacts of those are? So it's not just like, okay, here's the bad ransomware guys, but it's also things like Treasury coming out and saying you can't pay a ransom if they're on a sanctions list, or your insurer wanting specific requirements before they'll make a claim, or previous litigation, what information would be protected if you were dealing with litigation. And that might not be you being sued, but you may decide to sue your insurer because you're not getting the coverage, or a supply chain vendor, or whatever that might be. And then you've got to figure out, how does that look? Number 2 is understanding the risk. So understanding what assets you have, what you need to protect, and what those obligations are. And that really is your number 1 thing. figure that out, figure out what the threats around it look like, and then build out that program. Number three, the biggest piece for me is the reporting piece, being able to demonstrate tactically and from an operations perspective that you are doing what you need to do, that you remain resilient. At the same time, if things get bad, that you can demonstrate how quickly you found them. Because the reality is today, people expect to be breached. People expect these things to happen. No one is watertight, and that's okay. But what is important is saying, look, I understood the risks. I invested my resources to try and minimize those risks. Even I can't mitigate them fully or avoid them, I've at least tried to reduce them. And here's what I was prepared to do when things went bad, right? Here's how quickly we found it, how we responded to it, how we reduced the impact of the business, and so on. That's kind of what you need to do. And that really rolls into number five, right? Which is the absolute worst case, which is if there is a significant incident, right? Can you, do you understand what those obligations are in that? How do you bring in the board and the execs? Because they're going to have to make a lot of decisions here. The reality is the majority of decisions that are made in a security incident have nothing to do with technology. That is to say, a technical decision, the greater impact is to the business. So for example, if you had to cut off internet access or web-based services or mobile apps or whatever it is, that's when it's going to become a public event. Does it have an impact on the services that you provide to your customers and your partners? And if it does, again, there are obligations there. So you really do have to think about what that looks like long before you get to those questions. Like I said, they ask me all the time, like, when do we call in law enforcement, or should we, or what are the risks of doing that? How do we make an insurance claim? How would we notify a governing board, like a regulator or a privacy organization or whatever it might be? So this is just the tip of the iceberg, as you can imagine. There's so much here to discuss. I'd be happy to come back and talk a lot more about this in greater depth. Or reach out to Todd, reach out to I, and I'd be happy to, find some time and sit down with you and discuss it in greater detail. So that, Todd, I'm going to pass it back to you. I know we're running up, we got a couple minutes left.
Yeah, totally. No, awesome stuff. I have two questions. One, is a cover page still required on the TPS report? And maybe talk a little bit about how different parts of the organization view threats differently. Maybe just give a example of that. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I should have covered that. I meant to do that. So the executives need to be looking at fiduciary risk along with the board, right? So that comes down to, do I know what my risks are? Have I done something? Have I taken actions to try and mitigate, minimize? And where do I know my liability or my risk still hangs, right? So, there's certain things you can't control the economy, like things like that, right? From an IT perspective, it's understanding, what core facets of a security program do you need to put in place, right? What services do you have to have in place? From an employee perspective, so the non-technical, people, they need to understand their obligations. They need to, we need to empower them through awareness training and proper training and testing to help them identify threats early on. And for each one of those, it is role contextual, right? So for example, a finance person is going to get fake invoices. A marketing person is likely going to get scammed through some award, through a conference invite, things like that. Salespeople are going to get scammed through bluebird types of contracts or customer opportunities, right? They're going to pop. So helping each person understand how that kind of threat would manifest, how they're going to come at you, right? So what would it look like when it appears in your doorstep, your email inbox, and what do you need to do about it? And then the IT people, again, is coming back, and the technical people is thinking about, am I putting the right controls in place? How can I demonstrate the value of those controls? And then right up to the board, because otherwise, if you don't do this and you don't parse it out for each individual, it's not relevant to them. They say, oh yeah, I'm just a junior person in the company. Who's going to want to steal from me? I don't have access to the funds or IP or whatever. And it's simply not true. It doesn't matter who you are in the organization. You're a gateway, right?
Yeah, everybody's got a blind spot, or everybody's got a area where they're vulnerable. They just might not think it's significant. And it turns out, right, I mean, as we've seen it time and time again, the hackers only need to be right once, right? They can send out millions and millions of different, kind of threats, emails, whatever, forms, they only need one person to convert, right?
That's
And
right.
then they have access.
Oh yeah. And that's bang on, right? We always say that, right? You have to be right 100% of the time, and they only have to get it right once, and that's absolutely true. And they are extremely good at figuring out how to get in, and often they've already been in, right? So information has already been stolen somewhere and already compromised, and it's for sale, in these dark markets, like the one that just got shut down, for example, the Genesis market. And then, and another criminal's buying them because they're like, I know how to go after healthcare, or I know how to go to manufacturing or banking or whatever it might be. So they buy them up. And that's what you really have to be aware of.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, great stuff, Mark. Really appreciate the presentation. If you guys are looking for more info, reach out to us. We'll be reaching out to you guys shortly.